Before we get started on this reading, make sure that you realize that there are like vocabulary words over on the left-hand side. The word independence means freedom from control by another government or country. Petition is a formal written request made to an official, person, or organization. Common Sense is the name of a pamphlet that was published in 1776 by Thomas Paine. It was trying to persuade the American colonists that it only makes sense for them to support the idea of independence or breaking away from Great Britain. And the Declaration of Independence is the document written to declare the American colonies as an independent nation free from British rule. On the eve of independence, nearly a year passed between the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord and the British retreat from Boston. During that time, there was little talk of independence. Most colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects. Their quarrel was not with Great Britain itself, but with its policies towards the colonies. The Olive Branch Petition. Many Americans pinned their hopes for peace on King George. In July 1775, the Second Continental Congress sent a petition to George III asking him to end the quarrel. John Adams called the petition an olive branch. Olive tree branches are an ancient symbol of peace. By the time the petition reached London, however, the king had declared the colonies to be in open and avowed rebellion. He ordered his ministers to bring the traitors to justice. Being called a traitor was enough to change the mind of one of Washington's generals. The general confessed that he had long looked with some degree of horror on the scheme of separation. Now he agreed with Patrick Henry that colonists must be independent or slaves. Common sense. Many colonists, however, still looked with horror at the idea of independence. Then, early in 1776, a patriot named Thomas Paine published a fiery pamphlet entitled Common Sense. Paine scoffed at the idea that Americans owed any loyalty to King George. Of more worth is one honest man to society, he wrote, than all the crowned ruffians who ever lived. Paine also attacked the argument that the colonists' ties to Great Britain had benefited Americans. Just the opposite was true, he said. American trade had suffered under British control. Americans had also been hurt by being dragged into Great Britain's European wars. Paine ended with a vision of an independent America as a homeland of liberty. Ye that love mankind, he urged, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny, but the tyrant, stand forth. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. Within a few months, more than 120,000 copies of Common Sense were printed in the colonies. Paine's arguments helped persuade thousands of colonists that independence was not only sensible, but that it was the key to a brighter future. Thomas Jefferson drafts a declaration. A few weeks after the British left Boston, the Second Continental Congress appointed a committee to write a declaration, or formal statement of independence. The task of drafting the Declaration of Independence went to 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. Jefferson's job was to explain to the world why the colonies were choosing to separate from Britain. When in the course of human events, it began, if one group of people finds it necessary to break its ties with another, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they explain their actions. Principles on which to base a new government. Jefferson's explanation was simple but revolutionary. Loyalists had argued that colonists had a duty to obey the king, whose authority came from God. Jefferson reasoned quite differently. He based his argument on the principle of natural rights. All people are born equal in God's sight, he reasoned, and all are entitled to the same basic rights. He called these rights unalienable rights, meaning they were given by God and could not be surrendered to any government or taken away. In Jefferson's eloquent words, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments are formed, Jefferson said, to secure these rights. Their power to rule comes from the consent of the governed. If a government fails to protect people's fundamental rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. The people can then create a new government that will protect their safety and happiness. In this picture right here, it says, after Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Franklin and John Adams suggested some changes. The King's crimes. King George, Jefferson continued, had shown no concern for the rights of colonists. Instead, the King's policies had been aimed at establishing an absolute tyranny over these states, or the colonies. As proof, Jefferson included a long list of the King's abuses. In all of these actions, Jefferson claimed, George III had shown he was unfit to be the ruler of a free people. The time had come, Jefferson concluded, for the colonies' ties to Great Britain to be broken. These united colonies are, he declared, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The final break. On July 1st, 1776, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia's State House to debate independence. By noon, the temperature outside had soared into the 90s, and a thunderstorm was gathering. Inside the State House, emotions were equally hot and stormy. By the end of the day, the issue was still undecided. The next day was cooler and calmer. On July 2nd, all but one of the 13 colonies voted for independence. New York cast no vote. No delegate was more excited about the colony's decision than John Adams. He wrote to his wife Abigail, "The second day of July will be celebrated by succeeding generations with pomp and parade, with shoes," meaning shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. The debate over slavery. Adams was wrong about the date that would be celebrated as America's birthday, but only because Congress decided to revise Jefferson's Declaration. The delegates liked most of what they read, except for a passage on slavery. Jefferson had charged King George with violating the sacred rights on life and liberty of a distant people by carrying them into slavery. Almost no one liked this passage. Southerners feared that it might lead to demands to free the slaves. Enslaved African Americans provided much of the labor used on Southern farms. Northerners worried that New England merchants who benefited from the slave trade might be offended. Even delegates who opposed slavery felt it was unfair to blame the king for enslaving Africans. The passage was removed. Over here it says, any mention of slavery was removed from the Declaration of Independence because the slave trade was important to the economy of the many colonies. In the triangular trade route shown here, rum and iron were shipped from New England to Africa. In Africa, these products were exchanged for slaves. The slaves were taken to the West Indies, where many were traded for molasses and sugar. Finally, molasses, sugar, and remaining slaves were brought to New England. So here it's showing that the slaves are going to the West Indies, And then slaves, sugar, and molasses were coming to the colonies. And then the rum and iron that was made from these things would then be shipped back to Africa. This poster shows the delegates leaving Independence Hall in Philadelphia to announce the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Independence Hall, or Liberty Hall, is still up in a building in Philadelphia that you can actually tour. When you go there, it's part of the National Park Service, and you listen to the National Park Rangers actually give you a little information, and then you go into the main part of the building where you can see the room that the signers actually signed the Declaration of Independence. Independence Day. On July 4th, the delegates approved a final version of the Declaration of Independence. When they signed the document, they pledged to support independence with our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. This was a serious pledge. Every signer understood that he was committing an act of treason against Great Britain. If the new nation failed to win its freedom, each of them could very well upswinging from a hangman's rope, meaning that they would get hanged. Knowing this, Ben Franklin told the delegates, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." If you want to review this chapter, that is on there for you.